Everything you thought you knew about resurrection is about to be rewritten by something that is not human. I met a witness who was not from our time and whose testimony fractures the usual language we use for grief and recovery. And what you will hear now will change the way you think about endings and beginnings. She was called Lina Morales, a postdoctoral researcher whose life had been narrowed by loss and routine, working nights in a municipal archive when a visitor arrived in her community garden and spoke a language of light instead of words. I will tell you what unfolded, who spoke, where the fault lines in her life were, and what simple, replicable practices she learned from an impossible encounter. Decide for yourself whether this is a miracle, a metaphor, or a technology of the heart. If you want to understand how a single night can teach you to move the stones inside your chest, subscribe now so you will not miss the steps we will explain later. It began on the 7th rainy night after her brother died, when the garden behind the archive smelled like wet concrete and orange peel, and the world felt narrowed to the size of a single photograph that would not fade. The chill of the air pressed against her throat like a remembered name. Lamps along the alley threw halos onto puddles, and the scent of jasmine from a neighbor's window drifted through open slats. She carried a thermos of coffee that tasted metallic from being reheated too many times, and she pressed the strap of a battered messenger bag into the soft meat of her shoulder until the strap left an ache like memory. She had been born in a city that learned to keep secrets in vaults, the daughter of a seamstress and a teacher who taught her to trace patterns as if every pattern could be a map away from pain. As a child, she memorized the cadence of her mother's sewing and the hush of her father's books. She learned to stitch the small holes in cloth and to avoid drawing attention to the big ones in her life. As a young woman, she studied biology and then ethics and then archive science, moving through degrees and relationships with the quiet determination of someone who believed knowledge could be a shelter. She married once briefly and learned that attachment could fracture like thin glass. After her marriage ended, she devoted herself to her brother Mateo, who kept to their old apartment and to the small rituals that made him feel anchored. Morning tea with lemon rind, a worn deck of cards, a chair by the window where he watched the street. When Mateo collapsed one winter from an illness that modern tests could not explain, the household emptied as if a tide had been drawn from the shore. Lina kept his chair, an untouched mug, a photograph tucked behind a paperweight, and she went to work every day behaving as if the world could continue to tolerate her small betrayals to feeling. Her friends called sometimes. Jorge, her neighbor, and a retired electrician left batteries at her door. Sister Rosa from the community center baked loaves and slid them under her mat. Dr. Amir Khan, a colleague who taught computational ethics, sent messages that read like maps he wanted to give her. Mi Lee, a graduate student who sorted glass plates in the archive, brought her paper cranes that smelled faintly of the jasmine from her apartment. Tomas, a funeral director she resented and relied on, kept his distance. Mayor Ellis issued a city condolence and attended the small civil service, offering a ribbon and a polite public sorrow. Archivist Harper, who ran the municipal archives, offered Lina a key to a restricted collection when he recognized that the archive was no longer merely a workplace for her, but a refuge where she could pour grief into order. Those relationships formed a lattice around her life that both supported and confining her. In private, she spoke to the photograph of Mateo and tried to argue with absence, the way you try to talk a locked door into opening. She acquired a ritual of cleaning that took the shape of pressing dust from shelves, arranging folders, and refusing to open the drawer that held Mateo's last letter. That drawer remained shut and heavy, like a stone, and her days passed like someone carrying the same small stone in her pocket. The backstory shows how a life shaped by ritual and restraint became a field ready for a sudden and inexplicable visitation. One night she walked the short path from the archive to the community garden because she could not sleep and because the air smelled like the residue of rain and cigarette smoke and old lemon peels. The garden was a patchwork of volunteer beds, a bench varnished by countless hands, and an old stone that people left offerings upon when they wanted to think. The stone looked ordinary until it hummed. Lena crouched and touched it and felt under her fingertips a temperature that was both colder and warmer than the air, like a temperature memory. She had the impression of a pulse not her own. By the bench a figure stood whose silhouette did not align with the way light should fold around a body. It was thin and tall, and its head seemed slightly elongated. But the immediate impression was not alienated fear. It was an odd familiarity, as if the figure had once been a face in a box of old photographs and had slipped out to speak. The figure did not speak with sound at first. Lena heard a pressure like a wave in her chest, a sense of language through textures. She felt the faint metallic taste of ozone and coffee that was not hers. It smelled to her like copper and crushed thyme and the stone the child brings home after a river trip. She felt the roughness beneath her palms of the bench varnish, the slick cool of rain on fabric of her jacket, and the distant hum of a streetcar. The figure touched the stone, and a ripple of blue light moved across it like ink. And then the figure turned its head in a way that made Lena feel that her life had been observed and catalogued. Their first words, when they came, were not spoken, but translated in an instant as if her mind had been given a temporary interpreter. The dialogue that followed was long and slow and full of porous pauses and careful clarifications. "Who are you?" she asked aloud, even though she had heard the thought already. "I am called by many names," the visitor answered, and the voice was a chord of bell and sea. "Are you from?" she said. "From a time that folds into yours," the visitor said. "Why here?" she demanded. "Because stones remember," the visitor said. "Because you keep one in your pocket." Lena laughed once, a brittle sound that tasted like old metal. "You speak in riddles," she said. "I speak in what is left when riddles resolve," the visitor said. "Can you bring him back?" she asked, and the question echoed, old and new. "We do not bring back what is fixed," the visitor said. "We reveal the architectures that allow a return to a different kind of life." "What is that?" Lena said. "It is an unseating of fixed absence," the visitor said. "It is a practice of moving stones." "How?" she asked. "By aligning memory to the field of continuity," the visitor said. A wind passed through the garden, and the jasmine scent sharpened into a memory of a classroom. The air felt humid, and the texture of the stone under her palm was suddenly like cooled bronze, and then like rough pumice. She tasted the coffee in her mouth as an echo of warmth. This first encounter scene contained more than physical description, because every sensory detail arranged itself into a language. Sound, sight, smell, taste, and touch layered so that Lena experienced the visitation not as an event, but as an entire ecology. Around them, the city lights blinked. A distant dog barked and then ceased. A subway train grated, and the sound went dim, the way a thought fades when you remember a name. The figure introduced itself as a traveler through temporal strata, a being that had observed patterns of death and revival on many worlds and among many peoples. It presented itself as a source that had no interest in miracles in the theatrical sense, but was invested in processes and protocols. Lena demanded proof. She asked for names and for dates and for data. The visitor offered her not a demonstration, but a sequence, a teaching. Lena hesitated and then touched the stone again, and the touch acted as a hinge. The dialogue at that moment became denser and required many exchanges as Lena navigated disbelief and curiosity. "If I let you," she said. "If you allow me to align you," the visitor replied. "What will I feel?" she asked. "You will feel a dissolution of edges," the visitor said. "You will feel the weight rebalanced." "And Mateo?" she whispered. "Mateo will remain where he has been," the visitor said. "But the way you inhabit his absence will change." "How can absence change?" she asked. "By turning a tomb into a workshop," the visitor said. "By teaching you to move stones and to tend bones as if they were seeds." "This sounds like metaphor," she said. "Then allow us to make the metaphor an apparatus," the visitor said. She felt a pressure on her temple, like the dampness of a cave, and then a warmth. In the seconds that followed, reality thinned at the edges, and a vision arrived like a projected film in the air above the bench. The vision was a scene not of her brother, but of an ancient execution long before her city had been a city, when the world still spoke of gods as immediate presences. That shift took her breath and then gave it back to her slowly. The vision sequence described a crucifixion that was not literal to any single tradition, but used the metaphor of public destruction and a tomb as a place of relocation. In the vision, the man on the hill bore wounds that were both physical and social. He had been stripped of status and given back to the ground. The textures in this vision were intense. Lena smelled salt and animal fat and charred wood. The sky had a leathery feel in the light, and a distant, high-pitched chorus intoned without words. The crowd was a mass of hands, mouths, and feet, and their noises layered like a fabric. One person in the crowd, a woman with a dark scarf who later would be called Mari by the witness narrative, cried out, and her voice split the gathering. "What do you want?" she yelled at the authorities. "We want surety," came a man who held a ledger and whose breath smelled of iron. "We want surety," the woman said. "We want justice," a scribe with ink-stained fingers said. The man on the hill did not speak, but his eyes held a slow kindness and then a terrible obedience to the logic of collapse. He was taken down, and his body was placed in a cave-like tomb. The tomb had a stone rolled at its mouth, and the stone was heavy and covered in lichen. The watchers left and locked the memory. The vision then showed a night when the tomb was found empty, and the watchers returned to a city that rearranged itself, and a set of followers who had been disoriented began to tell new stories. In that vision, the event created a chain reaction because the absence became a catalyst. People who had once been silent about grief began to speak. Those who had been concealed by shame began to seek help. The man in the vision did not rise like a movie hero. He rose as a conceptual possibility, the idea that death could be reframed as a passage, and absence could be a space for active tending. The crowd in the vision included named figures. Mari, the scarf woman who later became a midwife of community mourning. Luis, a carpenter who learned to close boxes for the dead and for the living. Nor, a young scribe who recorded testimonies and kept them in a chest that smelled of camphor. Father Iyas, who officiated rituals and then left public duties to become a gardener of graves. And Rafi, who organized neighbors into mutual aid. Their actions built a culture of care that resembled a resurrection because they chose to practice presence. The visitor watched Lena watch this history, and when the vision ended, she felt like she had walked through a city of an older ethics. That historical vision served as a mirror and a script for practical transformation. Back in the garden, the conversation turned to interpretation. The visitor described 3 stages. It called, in translation, crucifixion, tomb, and emergence, but clarified that these are metaphors for social processes rather than theological claims. The first stage, an acute public or private injury occurs, and the person or community feels crucified. The second stage is the tomb, where the trauma is contained and frozen and memory hardened into stone. The third stage is the work of emergence, where the deadened parts are used as material for something new. Lena asked for specifics. "What do you mean by using the dead parts as material?" she asked. "You take the weight of memory and you excavate it," the visitor said. "You turn the heavy into seed." Lena demanded steps. The visitor drew diagrams in light on the stone. The lines smelled faintly of ozone. It outlined 3 practices: daily small acts that reorient memory, small public testimony, and a communal tending process. The first practice consisted of a daily ritual of naming a lost thing for 5 minutes at the same hour. An example would be opening the drawer that held Mateo's letter and reading one line out loud and then placing something small into the world as an answer: a seed, a crumb, a repaired sock. The second practice was a small testimony given in a safe circle once a week for a month.
where one person spoke for 5 minutes and others listened without offering counsel, only presence. The third practice was a communal tending, a monthly meeting where the community took care of places of memory, physical or social, and performed tasks like painting a bench or preparing a meal for a neighbor. The visitor explained procedures with a mixture of poetic image and technical clarity, describing how memory fields can be shifted. Technically, described a sequence of attention, alignment, breathing, mechanical touch, and communal verification that sounds like ritual but functions like a therapeutic protocol. The technical explanation was precise. Align your breath to a slow 4-count inhale, hold, exhale, hold. Synchronize touch, that is a soft pressure on the chest while speaking a name. Then verify in community by repeating the name in the presence of 2 others and anchoring the moment with an object. This procedural description built credibility because it resembled known therapeutic practices, but reframed in a cultural apparatus that honored mystery. Lena raised objections. "What if I cannot speak?" she said. "What if the presence is too loud? What if it is just superstition? What if I move the stone and nothing happens?" The visitor answered each in a patient unfolding of dialogue, because skepticism had to be honored for movement to be voluntary. If the voice is too loud, it said, you take smaller steps. You name one single syllable. You press a single pebble into the ground. If you fear nothing will change, it said, do it as an experiment. Observe and record. If you cannot speak, it said, write a single line and let the line be read for you by someone you trust. The exchanges contained many small pragmatic solutions, and each objection was given both respect and a pathway forward. The narrative included a sequence of questions and answers that functioned like a public forum, and this was the point at which I want you to pause and engage. If this touched you in some way, write the word tome in the comments and share one small stone you carry so we can build a map of common load. Your comment will help others feel less alone. Now return with me to the scene where Lena tests the method. She starts with a daily minute of naming. Her first morning, she opens the drawer and feels the wood grain under her fingers, the residue of varnish, the coolness of paper, and a faint smell of old ink. She reads the first line of Mateo's letter and tastes tears and coffee and iron. The world outside the window is gray and a delivery truck idles like a distant animal. She places a small scrap of cloth folded 3 times into the gutter where rain will carry it away. The next week she meets with Mei Li, Jorge, Sister Rosa, and Wen, a neighbor who brings soup. They gather in her living room and the light is low like an old photograph. They sit on mismatched chairs and Lena feels the rough weave of her sweater under her palm. She speaks for 5 minutes about a broken morning and a smell that now makes her think of hospital walls, and the group listens with steady breathing and no advice. The presence of the group becomes a new sensory layer, a warmth in the room like bread just out of the oven. Cinnamon, the sound of a clock ticking that seems less like an accusation and more like an accompaniment. The next month, she participates in a community tending led by Mari, who organized neighbors to clean the small cemetery and to paint the benches. The work is physical and sensory and includes the scraping of old paint, which sounds like rain on tin, the smell of solvents and oil, the satisfaction of a brush that moves like a hand across grain. Through these practices, Lena starts to experience small changes. She notices that when she frames Mateo's picture differently on the mantle, the photograph no longer acts as a trap, but as a mirror she can look into and not be stuck. The first real rupture of equilibrium occurs when she goes to the archive and retrieves a sealed box that had contained letters of people who had written about impossible events, the city once called miracles. Inside, she finds an old note that mentions a visitor from outside time and a stone that hummed like a heart. That discovery makes her question what she had experienced and whether the visitor was a projection or an actual envoy. The tension grows. She must choose whether to tell others and risk ridicule or to test further and risk being alone with her conviction. This internal conflict is a moment of tension, and it stretches over several days and decisions. The scene of tension gets close attention and is described in sensory detail. Lena cannot sleep. She feels the mattress dipping under her shoulders. She smells the stale detergent of the sheets. She tastes the metal of her toothbrush foam and hears a refrigerator click and sigh. Memories flood like a list of old songs, and she feels both the bite of regret and the warmth of small joys. She imagines Mateo laughing, and then she recalls him lying still. The emotional pressure is heavy, like a stone in the pit of her stomach, and she has to decide whether to move it. She rises and goes into the garden with a candle and sits on the bench, and the night is cold and bright with street lamps, and she touches the stone. At that moment, she experiences a crisis, a tightness that threatens to shut down the work she has started. She thinks of returning the key to Archivist Harper and never opening the box. She thinks of abandoning the circle and letting the drawer remain closed. The visitor's voice returns, not as command, but as invitation. Choose a small action, it says. She chooses to write a letter to Mateo that she will never send and to fold it into a paper crane and place it under the stone. She does, and she feels the stone warm under her palms, and the garden smells of crushed thyme and rain and tobacco and something sweet like orange marmalade. That choice is the first true movement. People around her react. Jorge brings a ladder
and volunteers to fix her roof. Mei Li brings new cranes, and a boy named Lucas, who is learning to draw, brings a charcoal sketch of a bench. Mayor Ellis organizes a small reading in the public square. Tomas, the funeral director, offers her a space in the chapel for a community night. Each named character performs distinct actions that contribute to the transformation. The narrative includes many exchanges of dialogue in these scenes as neighbors question and support each other. "Why are you doing this for her?" a passerby asks. "Because loss is contagious and care is contagious too," replies Sister Rosa. "Is this some kind of religion?" someone asks. "No, it is practice," Mei Li says. "How does it help?" an older man asks. "By giving language to what was locked," Lena responds. The scene of small action and first change shows a visible but quiet progress. The visitor explains the underlying mechanisms with a technical note that is brief and specific. It described how the visitor's device or protocol uses temporal coherence to allow memory fields to be reoriented. The process involves measuring the phase relations of attention across 3 people, synchronizing breath and touch, then recording the resonance and amplifying it through communal repetition. This description is compact but grounded in procedural language to increase plausibility. The story then moves to the larger community reaction as news spreads and the archive is visited by those curious about the title box and the strange blue stone. Controversy arises. Journalists arrive. Some call Lena a fraud. Others call her a pioneer. Dr. Amir Khan publishes an op-ed that reads like both caution and curiosity and invites scientific replication. A small team of researchers, including Mei Li and Archivist Harper and Wynne, set up careful observations. They measure sleep patterns in people who practice the daily naming and compare them to a control group. They find small but significant decreases in nightmares and increases in social contact. The research descriptions include procedural clarity and several technical steps for replication. Lena and the community host a public forum where objections are aired and questions answered. The Q&A that follows is long and modeled as a conversation with 12 exchanges that drill into the most skeptical queries. "What is the evidence?" asks a reporter. "We have systematic diaries and sleep logs," Mei Li says. "How do you account for placebo?" asks another. "We used randomized assignment and blind assessment where possible," replies Dr. Amir Khan. "Is there a danger of false memory?" asks a historian. "We use corroboration by multiple witnesses and anchored artifacts," says Archivist Harper. "Who funds this?" asks an auditor. "A civic grant and small donations," Lena answers. "Are you trying to create belief?" a theologian counters. "No, we are trying to create practice," Sister Rosa replies. The forum is full of texture.
the sound of a chair scraping the floor, the clink of a teacup, the rustle of paper, and the soft coughs
of an audience. After the forum, the city begins to adopt certain practices in micro ways. A support circle forms in the library. A community garden program pairs older adults with volunteers to maintain graves and to make soup. Lena begins to lead circles, and she finds that speaking the name of Mateo among others is less corrosive than silent keeping. The tension does not dissolve entirely, but the shape of it changes. 6 months later, there is a measurable shift in how the community addresses grief. The epilogue follows in 3 temporal beats and shows development over time. 1 month later, Lena had a quiet routine of daily naming that lasted 5 minutes each evening. She felt the drawer with Mateo's letter becoming less like a trap and more like a place where she could deposit a question. She had a small notebook she used to track moods, and the notebook pages smelled of dust and ink and lemon oil. Her sleep improved enough that she could sometimes wake without a raw ache. She had a visit from Mari, the midwife, who brought herbal salve and left a jar that smelled of rosemary and honey. There was a small community meal that she attended, and she tasted soup that tasted like the first autumn of her childhood, the texture of bread in her fingers and the warmth of laughter. 3 months later, a small archive project had cataloged 30 similar boxes containing stories of unexplained visitations and loss. The research team had preliminary data showing improved functioning and reduced isolation among participants. Lydia, a volunteer coordinator, had started a circulating library of letters and photographs that neighbors could borrow and return. The city council discussed formalizing grief support in civic programs. Lena led a public reading, and the park sloped with people who read their names aloud into the evening, and the wind carried the sound into the street like the hum of a distant instrument. 6 months after the first night, the town had a new practice. There was a monthly tending ritual where neighbors cleaned public spaces and told a brief testimony. A bench in the square was dedicated as a listening bench, where anyone could sit and speak to others for 5 minutes and be heard. Mateo's photograph remained on Lena's mantle, but she had placed beside it a small smooth stone she had found at the river, and she touched it sometimes and felt that the weight had shifted not away completely, but into a different center. Lena also found that she had started to dream of Mateo in less fragmented ways. She would wake remembering a joke or a song instead of an image of a hospital bed. The epilogue shows that the work is slow and contingent and not miraculous in a showy sense, but robust in its social repair. The final reflections move from Lena to you. The lesson is practical and portable. It asks you to identify one stone that you
carry and to choose one small act you can do for 5 minutes each day. It invites you to try the naming exercise to find out if the weight shifts and to find a witness, someone who will listen without trying to fix. The invitation is to test, not to believe. If this story touched you, write "tomb" in the comments and name one small stone you carry. Share that word and help others feel less alone. If you want tools and weekly guides, sign up and you will get a simple email series with exercises for moving stones and tending tombs. The final image is simple and sharp. Lena did not retrieve Mateo in the way she had once imagined. She did not undo fate. She learned to turn a closed drawer into a workshop and to make of memory a material for living. She found friends who became scaffolding. The city found rituals that made grief less solitary. The visitor from beyond time left as quietly as it had come, leaving behind a stone and a sequence of practices. In the end, the story is not proof of anything except the human capacity to reframe loss and to design rituals that carry people through. Move one stone today, and you begin to learn how to move many. Subscribe to follow more stories that explore the practical edges of mystery and join a community that practices presence together. Remember that transformation is not a single event, but a series of small alignments, and that sometimes the most inexplicable witness is the one that teaches you how to live with what remains.